How does it affect women differently? Because if you're saying that it's innate, it's not a sort of social construct. There's something deep within our wiring in men and women that makes us have a different sort of proclivity towards sex, casual sex. Why does that have a consequence that's negative for women?
Basically, what women are more likely to want is monogamy, like not necessarily marriage, but certainly signals of commitment. If you think about this in terms of our evolutionary history, it makes perfect sense, right? Because having sex is pretty much the most consequential thing a woman can do, right? Because if you get pregnant, you've got 9 months of pregnancy, which is risky in itself, childbirth, which is very risky in the ancestral environment, less so now, fortunately. And then you've got maybe 15 years or something of having to look after a child until it's capable of being economically self-sufficient. That's an enormous thing to happen in your life. Whereas, and it also means that women can only really reproduce once a year, absolute max, right? Whereas men, in theory, can reproduce thousands of times a year and can have basically no involvement in raising the children, but take basically no risks whatsoever. So if you look at it in those terms, of course women would be pickier. Of course they would. And that is indeed what we see. But I think that the reason that young women express so much unhappiness at the moment with the sexual culture is that a lot of young women kind of go along with it. I know this is kind of surprising to men, right? And I've spoken to men about this who find this completely bemusing. They're like, if you don't want to have sex, don't have sex. It's fine. Like, what's the big problem? Like, women are so lucky because they can't step out onto the street without being propositioned. They can have, they have so much choice. Like, you girls are so lucky. What are you complaining about? And I think it's this problem that two problems. One is that both sexes are not necessarily very good at understanding what the other sex actually want. And that's partly comes from the fact that I don't think we're honest enough about sex differences. So like men think that the fact that women can get casual sex at any time of any day is amazing. And women are like, but I don't want that. That's like horrible. I don't want to shag some random man on the street, right? So there's that gap in there's that empathy gap. And similarly, I think women have an empathy gap. Like they probably don't realise how many men basically don't have access to any kind of sexual relationships and feel incredibly resentful and frustrated about that. They don't realise how scary it is for men to approach a woman, things like that. So there's like a mutual sort of incomprehension. And I think the other thing is men find it very hard to imagine doing what a lot of young women do, which is basically going along with sex that they don't really want to have because they want to be polite. And because they don't want to scare off a man who maybe they do fancy. And because they don't want to be uncool and because they don't want to be weird and they don't want to be a prude. One of the features of teenage girl psychology, and maybe this is into the 20s as well, but particularly teenage girls, is teenage girls are so concerned about what's normal. Whenever you have contagious mental illnesses, which like historically are quite common, so something like the Salem witch trials, apparently girls are now getting Tourette's from TikTok because it's like a viral thing on TikTok. Hysteria in the 19th century, anorexia. Like, there's a lot of examples of these, right, where mental illnesses, which are seen to be socially contagious, people catch it from each other, you end up with this mimetic effect. They always start with teenage girls, always. Sometimes they spread to other groups, but teenage girls are always like the first, And I think it's because teenage girls, probably for self-protective reasons, there must be some adaptive reason here, are very, very socially sensitive. They're very constantly aware of their social position, what other people are doing, what's cool, what's not cool, obsessed, which is also translates to things like fashion and slang. Slang, ditto. A lot of slang starts with teenage girls because they're this very mimetic group, right? Mm. And that's fine, like that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does sometimes have bad effects. And one of them is, for instance, the idea that being a prude is incredibly cringe has taken hold really, really effectively among this group of girls. And so, I'll talk to girls or read or listen to girls saying like, I went along with the most like degrading, upsetting, whatever sexual things because like, I don't know why, because I wanted him to think I was cool, because I didn't, you know, and I think that's something that a lot of people find difficult to empathize with, and will say, and some men do say, in criticism of my position, like, why don't these girls just sort of get a grip?
When you say that there's young girls and women going along with it,
Yeah.
are you talking about both the type and the frequency of sex, or are you just talking about the casual sex and then the different ways people have sex, like BDSM and choking and these kinds of things?
Yeah, so all of the above.
Okay.
I mean, I think particularly it's the BDSM is a bit of a complicated one.
We'll get to that then.
Yeah, we can get onto that.
One, but...
in terms of the casual sex thing, so like having sex on a first date,
okay,
kind of thing, historically very, very, very rare. Like such a weird cultural convention, right?
And you think that happened because...
Well, because the pill, number one.
Yeah.
Because it means that you can do it without pregnancy being high risk. Mm-hmm. And I think it's all ends up being downstream of that it then changes. Like it basically used to be, you can actually read accounts of women who were in their 20s, say, at the time when the pill came along, and they'll say, it used to be the case that you go out on a date and the expectation is we will not be having sex, right? That was the agreed upon thing. Not to say it never happened, obviously it did, but that was the default. And then you might have sex on engagement or when you get married or maybe when you're going steady, you know, that expression you hear in like old high school films. But that was a way down the track, right? And then the pill comes along and you read women saying like it suddenly completely changed things. It suddenly was like the default was not, we're not having sex. The default was we might. And so suddenly it became a negotiation and it became there's this evolutionary psychologist, David Buss, who specializes in human sexuality. And he writes about this sort of eternal power play, basically, where women would like to wait longer before they have sex and men would like to have sex sooner. And there's always this sort of volleying back and forth, like who's going to win, basically, right? And the pill massively shifts it in the have sex sooner direction. And so, yeah, you say women who, you know, it used to be the assumption I would not have sex after a date. And now I'm having to this is so often what actually is happening in Me Too kind of cases. I mean, obviously Me Too cases, there's a lot of range. You've got straightforward, really criminal behavior, like Harvey Weinstein or whatever. But you also quite often what's going on is it's so much more subtle than that. It's like the Aziz Ansari case. Do you remember that? Quite an interesting case because he, in terms of the response, so Aziz Ansari, you know, famous actor, comedian, he goes on a date with this woman who's a fan and it's all going well. And then they go back to his and he wants her to have sex and she doesn't want to, basically. But he's like a famous man who she likes, like she might want to in the future. She doesn't want to offend him. She doesn't want to mess it up. And so there's this like subtle kind of tussle and they end up doing some sexual stuff or whatever. She goes home, she feels terrible. She subsequently says to him, you took advantage, basically, by text. He says sorry. And then later she sort of spills the beans in a magazine article. And that kind of thing is basically an invention of the sexual revolution, that kind of conflict where there's that degree of ambiguity. It wasn't that unreasonable for him to think that sex would happen. It wasn't that unreasonable. The problem that she found herself in is that she had to try and as politely as possible say no without, that's a really difficult social game, isn't it? Particularly when everyone's drunk, right? And she ended up, I guess, like they both messed up to some degree. Like he didn't read her social cues. She didn't communicate clearly. Like so often that's what's really going on with these Me Too cases. There's so much ambiguity in terms of what everyone is supposed to do. And you've got this tussle between what men and women prefer. And I mean, adding alcohol is really bad. You know, there's this bias that men have. It's like a deep-seated bias where men will tend to see sexual interest where there isn't. They're more likely to see sexual interest where there is none. They kind of overestimate how much women fancy them, basically. I know.
What are we talking about?
And alcohol makes it worse.
Oh, really?
Yeah, alcohol exaggerates that effect. So if a man's drunk, he's more likely to see sexual interest when it isn't there. And then if she's drunk as well, she's less able to successfully navigate this difficult social situation. Do you know what I mean? It does just feel like we're the lack of social rules just sort of sets everyone up to fail, and it's kind of inevitable that you're going to end up with these I guess tragedies, right? Of people not understanding one another.
So sex becoming a negotiation now, when historically it wasn't such a negotiation, and therefore sex happening much sooner in the interaction between men and women, often on the first date, maybe the second date. You're kind of alluding to it there, but I just want to get clarity on, you're saying it harms both men and women in the long term.
I think in different ways.
Yeah.
So I think the harm that's done to women is feeling... is emotion. Well, no, there are obviously some situations where the worst possible thing happens. You know, you go home with a man who turns out to be incredibly dangerous. More common is women just feeling bad about themselves.
How do we know that? Like, have they done
survey data?
Oh, really?
Yeah. You just ask women, like, how do you feel after different kinds of sexual encounter?
Like a one-night stand?
Yeah. And then you ask men the same thing. And women feel disgusting, basically, to some degree, is sort of the dominant. I included this quiz in my book, right, for men and women, like basically for people who had casual sex of some kind or another, right, who participated in this culture. And I sort of pooled the questions from my male and female friends. And one of the questions for women was, have you ever had a consensual sexual experience which now makes, thinking about it in retrospect, makes you feel like kind of physically uncomfortable, that gives you a disgust response? And so many women say yes to that. And one of the reasons for that is that women have a much lower disgust threshold than men do. So like women feel disgust more easily than men do, in response to all sorts of things, but including in response to not non-consensual, but unwanted sex. You see, like the kind of subtle distinction, like legal, but not really desired sex. Women are more likely to find that just makes them feel disgusted.
Because? Well,
probably because of this evolutionary thing, right, where like having sex with a man who you don't want to get pregnant by is a bad decision.
And a big risk.
Yeah.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.